All right, so let's talk more about photosynthesis. So this is a chemical formula for photosynthesis, and it's something that it might be important for us to remember it. So in this particular picture, what we have is an arrow, and an arrow is pointing towards the right. So to the left side of the arrow, this is what we call the reactants. So the reactants, it's what we put into this reaction. So what do we need in order to do photosynthesis? You need sunlight, you need water, you need carbon dioxide, and to the right side of the arrow, it's what we call the products. So this is what comes out of this chemical reaction. So this is what we produce, or this is what is produced whenever a plant is doing photosynthesis. So what is produced? Oxygen and glucose. So in the case of plants, they actually use glucose in order to do cellular respiration in order for the plants to produce their own energy. Again, so one more time. So this is a chemical reaction, photosynthesis. So we have an arrow, and the arrow is pointing towards the right. So anything to the left side of the arrow is what we call the reactants. That's what goes into this chemical reaction. So you need sunlight, you need water, and you need carbon dioxide. And what do you produce? So anything to the right side is the products, or this is what we produce: oxygen and glucose. Okay. So in the case of plants, photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. So chloroplast, it's the organelle that plants and algae uses in order to capture the energy from the sun in order to produce their food, in order to produce their energy, if you will. So the chloroplast, it's like a solar panel. You know how a solar panel, they basically capture the energy from the sun, and then you can use that in order to power, like say, for example, a light bulb or different items in your house. In the case of the plant, the chloroplast is basically like the solar panel. So it captures the energy from the sun and it uses it to produce carbohydrates such as glucose. Okay, so the energy from the sun, it's made out of different components. Specifically, so light energy is made out of what we call photons. And even photons are made out of different wavelengths. And depending on the wavelength, it contains different amounts of energy. So if you have a longer wavelength, then that means that that wavelength has less energy. If you have a shorter wavelength or a much frequent wavelength, then that means that you have more energy. So let me say it one more time. The longer the wavelength, the less energy it has. The shorter the wavelength, or the more frequent, if you will, the wavelength, the more energy it has. In the case of plants absorb the energy that is on the visible spectrum. So on the visible spectrum, it's made out of different, if you will, colors of light. Now, in the case of plants, they are able to absorb most of the energy that is on the visible spectrum. However, not all types of energy. So in this case, when it comes to certain plants, they look like the wavelength that they don't capture, or the wavelength that they reflect. So in the case of leaves of the plants, right? So the reason why they look green is because they are able to absorb any other color of light except for green. So essentially, they reflect green light, and this is why a leaf looks green, if you will. Again, I want to say it one more time. So in the case of the leaves of plants, so they're able to absorb the majority of the different colors from the visible spectrum. However, they do not capture, or they do not absorb rather, the green light. So what they do is that instead of it, they reflect it. And this is why a plant looks green. A plant looks green because it reflects green light and it's able to absorb any other color of light. So photosynthesis occurs in two steps. One that we call the light dependent reaction, and the second one that we call light independent reaction. Now you gotta be careful because a lot of people, what happens is that just because the second step is called light independent reaction, they think that it happens at night, or that means that it happens when there's no light. And that is not true. That's not the case. Both of them actually happen simultaneously. But the reason why it's called light dependent reaction for the first step is because that's when we capture the energy from the sun. And on the second step, it's called light independent reaction because we use a different source of energy, essentially chemical energy. All right, so for the first step, so what happens is that chlorophyll, which is the pigment that is found within the chloroplast, captures the photons of light, so captures the energy from the sun. Okay, so kind of like the solar panel, if you will. Now, the energy from the sun, it has basically a lot of energy. Okay, and so what happens is that it hits a protein within the chloroplast. And so this protein loses an electron. And so that electron, it's super excited, okay, has a lot of energy, and it jumps from protein to protein. And essentially, what happens on the first step, and I'll go more in detail on the next slide, is that we produce a very special molecule, a molecule that we call adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So that molecule is basically equivalent to the energy that the plant uses. And then on the second step, we use that ATP in order to make the carbohydrates, such as glucoses, which then the plant itself will use in order to produce more energy. So let's continue talking more about photosynthesis. So the full information is going to make your brain hurt. But it's going to make your brain hurt because you're learning something new. So on the first step of photosynthesis, chlorophyll, which is the pigment within the chloroplast, captures the rays of the sun. So the rays of the sun have a lot of energy. And so what happens is that we're hitting a complex of proteins called photosystem 2. And in reality, that name doesn't matter. Just know that it's a complex of proteins. And so what's happening here is that we are breaking bonds. And so we're releasing electrons. So those electrons become what we call excited, which means that they have a lot of energy. And so what happens is that they're jumping from protein to protein. And because photosystem 2 has lost an electron, it's very unstable. And so it's not happy. And that's where water comes to save the day. So a water molecule is made out of hydrogens and oxygen. And so what happens is that the water molecule is split in half. And so we're breaking, if you will, the bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen. And so we are releasing electrons. And so those electrons jump into photosystem 2. And that makes photosystem 2 stable, so now it's happy. So now what happens to the hydrogens and the oxygens within the water molecule? So the oxygens just basically diffuse right out of the cell. And if you guys remember, oxygen is one of the products of photosynthesis. What about the hydrogens? So the hydrogens are pumped into the lumen. So we are building a gradient of hydrogens. Okay? So we're building pressure, if you will. Now, in photosystem 1, which is another complex of proteins, another thing that's happening. So those electrons, eventually, the electrons from photosystem 2 eventually reach photosystem 1. And what happens is that they jump into a protein called NAD+. So NAD+, a hydrogen binds to NAD+, and it becomes NADPH. So what's the function of NADPH? One silly example that I use in the class is that NADPH, it's like the city bus. So what's the function of the city bus? The city bus carries people to where they need to be. So carries people to their destination. So the bus itself is going to represent the NADPH, and the people that are riding the bus are kind of like the electrons. So the function of the NADPH is to carry electrons where they need to be. In this case, the second step of photosynthesis. So NADPH, it's what we call an electron carrier because it carries electrons. All right. So another thing that's happening in the first step. So if you guys remember, I told you that we were building a gradient of hydrogens. So those hydrogens want to move to the other side. There's only one way they can do this. It's through a very specialized protein called ATP synthase. Now this ATP synthase has a pore through the middle where hydrogens can diffuse. Now on one side of ATP synthase, we have a molecule called ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. And on the other side, we have a phosphate group. These two molecules are far apart, but whenever the hydrogen goes right through the middle, it brings the ADP and the PI from the opposite sides. They bring them together so we can make a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, it's the molecule that the cell uses as a source of energy. And essentially, that's how ATP is produced on the first step of photosynthesis. Okay, so now let's talk about the second step of photosynthesis. So this is where we're going to be producing those carbohydrates. So carbon dioxide goes into the cell through an opening that is found in the leaves of the cell. Specifically, that opening is called the stomata. So whenever carbon dioxide goes inside through the stomata, it binds to a molecule called rubisco. So rubisco is a 5-carbon molecule. So whenever carbon dioxide binds to rubisco, it makes it a serious carbon molecule. Now this makes rubisco very unstable, and what happens is that rubisco breaks in half. So essentially we are producing 2 3-carbon molecules, and this molecule is called 3-phosphoglycerate. Now 3-phosphoglycerate is converted to another molecule by an enzymatic reaction. So it's converted into 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And that's when NADPH comes into the picture. So NADPH comes and drops off its electrons, and 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is converted to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate by an enzymatic reaction. Now, 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate come together to form a 6-carbon molecule, or a carbohydrate. A carbohydrate such as glucose, cellulose, or any other carbohydrate. Now, the thing is, like, not every single glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate becomes a carbohydrate. Some of them are actually converted by a series of enzymatic reactions into ribulose biphosphate. And then ribulose biphosphate, right, enters the cycle again, where it's going to be converted into 3-phosphoglycerate. And the cycle continues, where some of the molecules are going to be converted into carbohydrates, and other ones are going to be converted back into rubisco. Okay, so just to reiterate what I talked about on the previous slide. So on the second step of photosynthesis, that's when we're actually making the carbohydrates. So carbon dioxide diffuses through the stomata, and through a series of enzymatic reactions, that carbon dioxide is going to be converted into carbohydrates such as glucose, cellulose, or any other carbohydrate. And essentially, the second step is what we call a carbon fixation.